All right, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this museum conversation, which is for the Palmer Museum of Art's special exhibition, Summer Light, American Impressionist Paintings from the Thomas Clark Collection. I'm Alicia Skeef, a graduate assistant at the Palmer Museum and also a summer curatorial research intern, and I am pleased to welcome you to this event. We will be having a Q&A at the end of our program, so if at any time a question pops up, feel free to use the Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom bar at the bottom of your screen. I will be monitoring the questions throughout and holding the questions to be addressed at the end. Also, I just want to make a note that this program is being recorded and will be shared in about a week on our YouTube channel. So search the Palmer Museum of Art to find that. With that, I would like to introduce our two speakers, the Palmer Museum's director, Erin and Adam Thomas, Curator of American Art, who co-curated this exhibition. They will be speaking to us today about the artist and art featured in the exhibition, as well as Thomas Clark, the collector. So I'm going to hand it off to Erin now.
Thanks, Alicia. And thank you all for joining us for this virtual museum conversation. This is the 10th program in our Museum Conversation series. Today, we're going to discuss the exhibition Summer Light, how it came into being, the premise of the show, the featured artists, and the collector behind the paintings on the walls of the gallery, Thomas Clark. First slide, please. Tom Clark's journey into the world of collecting began with this small plein air oil sketch, Emerging Sales by Irving Ramsay Wiles, which he acquired in 1983. This oil sketch became the catalyst for building a collection over 4 decades of pre-1940 American Impressionist paintings, which today numbers over 170 works. You'll note that I've included a portrait of the artist Irving Ramsay Wiles on my slide, because the artist and their story and their contributions to American Impressionism is as important to Tom Clark as the work of art itself. Tom is very much a collector of artists of this period, and he takes great pleasure in acquiring the works of those who have fallen outside the canon of American Impressionism, which is generally focused on the first generation of artists, such as Childe Hassam, Theodore Robinson, John Henry Twachtman, and William Merritt Chase. It is often the students of the luminaries of this period that Tom focuses his attention on. For example, Wiles was a student of the celebrated painter William Merritt Chase while at the Art Students League. Chase is one of the key figures in the history and dissemination of American Impressionism. And though Wiles was an accomplished artist in his own right, he is not as well known as his mentor. Tom applies a similar methodology to many of the works in his collection. His interest in the pedagogy surrounding Impressionism and how the lessons were transferred or imparted from teacher to student. And he's deeply invested in collecting works that relate to the number of regional art colonies that flourished in the United States in the first 4 decades of the 20th century and became important centers for the spread and dissemination of Impressionism in this country. These are the themes that we will discuss as part of today's conversation. Next slide. I want to show you some images of the interiors of Tom's home in upstate New York to give you a sense of how he lives with his collection and its scale and scope. Tom carefully researches the artists he collects before making a purchase. He marvels in the discovery process whereby the contributions of many lesser known painters of the period are rediscovered and reassessed, especially women artists, which has become a key feature of his collection. Indeed, almost 25% of Tom Clark's collection is comprised of works by women artists. For Tom Clark, collecting the work of women artists who contributed to the legacy of Impressionism is a special area of interest and concern. He believes that women's artistic achievements have been greatly overlooked and deserve greater recognition. And it's important to stress that many of the artists we're going to discuss today, including the women artists, did not go unrecognized in their own day, although many of them aren't as well known to us today. By contrast, they belonged to prestigious arts organizations. Many were national academicians. They received awards. Their works entered museum collections, and they attracted the attention of art critics and collectors alike. As we will discuss today, one of the greatest testaments to the enduring popularity of Impressionist painting in the United States was the establishment of summer schools, art colonies, artist societies, and sketching clubs that resulted in the persistence of the plein air movement in this country and brought about new adherence to the aesthetic well into the 20th century. Next slide. Tom's passion for collecting particularly landscape paintings is rooted in his deep love of nature. He credits his collection with sharpening his observations of the natural world, exposing its hidden colors and details. And this abiding affection is fostered in part by the rolling hills of Saratoga County, where he lives. And from the windows of his rural home, he encounters landscape compositions that echo many of those found on the walls of his house. A little bit about Tom's background. Many of you will be pleased to know that he was born and raised in Erie, Pennsylvania. He went on to receive his PhD in psychology from Cornell University. And there he later served as the director of the Counseling Services Center. This launched Tom's career in higher ed and led to other positions, including the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he served as the director for the study of higher education and the director of the University Without Walls program. While at State University of New York, Empire State College, Tom served as a dean and then director for the Center for Individualized Education, where he became a nationally recognized expert on mentoring. Tom later became academic vice president and then president of Rockland Community College, State University of New York. In recent years, he has concentrated on executive coaching and mentoring and has provided assistance for clientele from major corporations. The exhibition Summer Light is the first presentation of works from his larger collection. There's 24 paintings on view in the gallery from his larger collection of 170 works. And it is a forthcoming promise gift to the Palmer Museum of Art. And it will be accompanied by an endowment to support the study, research, publication, and exhibition of pre-1940 American Impressionism. I want to take this opportunity on behalf of the Palmer Museum and Penn State to thank Tom for his generous commitment and for sharing his joy and passion for collecting art with the university, our students, and with you, our audience. I'm going to turn the monitor over to Adam, who's going to tell you more about the exhibition and its central theme.
Great, thanks, Erin, and thank you everyone for joining us. We decided to distill Tom Clark's extensive collection down to the summer theme for this exhibition, feeling that there were a number of key works and key threads to explore through it. As Erin mentioned, there's 24 paintings total in this show. We won't be able to talk about all of them today, but we'll touch upon most of them. So through these paintings, the exhibition explores the kind of atmospherics of summer, of sunlight and water, and of sort of various sun-charged environments around the United States, showing how artists adapted and sort of responded to Impressionist idioms, to their local needs, to their local enclaves, really throughout the United States. And this notion of Impressionism is a kind of catch-all term that animates their work, and to some extent is less about adhering to some strict or singular or controlling kind of doctrine than about kind of creating accessible surface effects, I think, and also about, of course, exploring effects of natural light. And so in the exhibition, we wanted to bring together and strike a balance between kind of inland scenes, like you see on the right in the George Loftus Noise, and coastal subjects, like you see on the left in the work by Frederick Smith, as well as works that sort of incorporate the figure, the human body, and those that are more pure landscape in orientation, as well as balance, men artists and women artists, and about half the exhibition is comprised of women. And then also kind of to show, more well-studied and sort of more well-known artists. Here, Noyes sort of being that figure in this pairing, and then artists who are a little bit lesser well-known and to a certain extent kind of more challenging to research. So to illustrate these sort of some of the kind of background thinking about the exhibition, I just present you these two works, these two artists. Both of the artists actually studied in Paris for a time. Frederick Smith was born in Cincinnati, but his career is a little bit less well studied than Noyes, who also studied in Paris in the 1890s, and they're about of the same generation. And this is a generation that's slightly older than most of the other artists in the exhibition. So I thought it was a nice kind of starting place to sort of introduce some of these ideas. Noyes would have kind of encountered and developed a commitment to painting out of doors or en plein air while in France in the 1890s. And the current scene is likely a New England subject, probably Vermont or New Hampshire. He's known to have painted around those environs, those states in these years. And for Noyes, I think also, the thematic ideas of the exhibition really kind of come to the fore. The ideas around sort of sunlight as an important kind of guiding principle in the explorations of light. So, critical response to Noyes in his own period sort of offer this kind of commentary. For example, in 1900, one writing how, quote, the feeling of sunshine is perhaps the most pervasive note that runs through his work. He seems to comprehend its every subtle phase, for example. And then, Noyes, again, more so than Smith here, generating a lot of kind of critical commentary in his day. And also, an artist who himself sort of thought and kind of reflected on, on Impressionism as a movement, on the kind of tenets of it. So he wrote himself in a 1905 track that, painting in a kind of impressionistic mode was, as he saw it, to put sunshine into a picture was to give life to it, to give it a kind of vibrating intensity. So just briefly, then, one of the other currents of the show is the rise, as Erin alluded to, the rise of different sort of summer art colonies around the turn of the 20th century. And they're important for this kind of teaching and for the dissemination of Impressionist ideas. Many were springing up sometimes in sort of proximity to more populous urban centers where the artists would have kind of spent the other months of the year. So with that, I'll turn it back to Erin to delve now further into one art colony in particular.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. I think one of the greatest testaments to the enduring popularity of Impressionist painting was the establishment of art colonies that helped to sustain the plein air movement in America and generated new adherence in a way to the Impressionist aesthetic. And they also fostered a strong community of artists who could gather together and focus on intimate scenes of country towns and villages and tranquil coastal communities, sometimes untouched by the speed and spectacle of the modern age. Slide, please, Adam. Of all the art colonies at first in the United States, the art colony on Cape Ann, Massachusetts, was home to the oldest art colony and attracted several artists featured in the exhibition. I also want to mention this is a great strength of Tom Clark's collection, artists related to Cape Ann, and not all of them are on view in the exhibition at the museum. The Cape Ann Peninsula, as you can see from my slide, is located around 40 miles north of Boston And since the middle of the 19th century, this picturesque seaport, the oldest in the country, has been a gathering place for artists. Cape Ann offered artists a plethora of paintable scenery, from the fleets of colorful vessels, docks, wharfs, bungalows, and fishing shacks, to the people who lived and worked there, including the ubiquitous net menders and fishermen. Next slide, please. To expand on this historical backdrop, I just want to mention two artists in particular who are very strongly linked to the kind of artistic legacy of Cape Ann. And they're important to note as we discuss Cape Ann's emergence as a major art colony. And the first is Fitzhenry Lane, image on the left here, who was born and spent much of his adult life in Gloucester. He was one of the first artists to capture in dozens of luminous canvases Cape Ann's tranquil coves and harbors, and the clear, radiant light that would come to identify the distinct scenery of Cape Ann, and it's part of what made it so popular. His canvases possess a timeless quality of stillness and tranquility and a sense of calm that almost suggests a spiritual bond between humankind and the natural world. Likewise, Winslow Homer, on the images on the right, created many of his most memorable scenes on Cape Ann between 1873 and 1880. He stayed in Gloucester and later 10 Pound Island and produced numerous watercolors and oil paintings that focused on the children and their activities along the shoreline. Homer's works are pervaded by an overriding sense of calm, in a way similar to Lane, and it's enhanced by this glowing, radiant light. Although there's a serious tone as well, as he often shows children waiting for the safe return of loved ones at sea. By the 1890s, Gloucester and the nearby town of Rockport had emerged as major centers of Impressionist activity. I guess this is hardly surprising given the area's association with such noted artists as Lane and Homer. The special qualities of light for which this picturesque region was known, along with the imminently paintable scenery. Next slide. And it was during this period that the major figures associated with the first generation of American Impressionists, including Childe Hassam and Willard Metcalf and John Henry Twachtman, visited Cape Ann to capture its dazzling sunlight and picturesque subjects. Childe Hassam on the left was one of the first American Impressionists to paint in Gloucester. He first visited in 1890, just after his return from Europe, and he continued to visit the region over a 29-year span. This view of Gloucester Harbor was painted in 1899, and it exemplifies his fully developed Impressionist style, characterized by an intense light-filled scene, use of complementary colors, and the arbitrary cropping. Note particularly the partially depicted houses in the foreground. And then, of course, this very high horizon line, which gives the painting a sort of overall compositional flatness that was favored by the Impressionists. Hassam's reluctance to completely dissolve the forms of his composition into kind of flecks of paint, and his use of firmly defined contours that depict an identifiable American place, complete with colonial architecture, reveal his commitment to realism, which is a feature of American Impressionism. Now, Childe Hassam persuaded his friend, Willard Metcalf, image on the right, to paint in Gloucester. And in the summer of 1895, Metcalf created what is considered his most ambitious and best-known painting of Gloucester Harbor, which you see in the slide. It earned him the prestigious Webb Prize at the 1896 exhibition of the Society of American Artists. And it is among the first American landscapes that Metcalf executed after his return from France, where he had spent time in the art colony at Giverny. Now, works such as Gloucester Harbor demonstrate also Metcalf's Americanization of French Impressionism by specifically referencing a New England landmark, and this would become a sort of feature of his work. Metcalf's glowing image of this sort of sun-kissed, peaceful harbor is painted from the same vantage point as the one by Childe Hassam that we just talked about. Both prospects are taken from Banner Hill in East Gloucester, looking over Smith's Cove. In Hassam's view, you see more of rocky neck defined by its bright red plant chimney. Adam, I don't know if you can point that out. And then Gloucester itself fills the horizon line with the landmark City Hall clock tower, which was the town's highest point. Next slide, please. I wanted to show you, here's a contemporary view of Gloucester from Banner Hill. This is the same view I just showed you in the paintings by Hassam and Metcalf. From Banner Hill, but note the telegraph poles and the wires. And I think from this you can draw your own conclusions about what the Impressionists were omitting from their interpretations of Gloucester Harbor and Cape Ann. Next, please. John Henry Twachtman responds to his colleagues Hassam and Metcalf with this vision of Gloucester Harbor, painted in the summer of 1900, the year of the artist's first of 3 summers in Gloucester. It is also taken from the same vantage point as his colleagues, that's Banner Hill. So using the now familiar high horizon line, Twachtman emphasizes the picture's flatness further by his use of strong diagonals, which was inspired by Japanese art. The details of the busy harbor, which were emphasized in Hassam and Metcalf's view, are diminished, as are the nostalgic references to colonial past. And they're all subsumed in this artful arrangement of shapes, textures, and patterns that are suggestive of wharves and water and boats. So the larger point here is that together, Hassam, Metcalf, and Twachtman establish an emblematic view of Gloucester that would greatly influence other plein air painters who followed in their footsteps. And as a result, Cape Ann would continue to thrive in the first 4 decades of the 20th century due to this rich legacy of Impressionist painting that this first generation firmly establishes. Next slide. This brings us to the role of women artists in the early 20th century who would begin to fill the ranks of plein air painters and constitute a large percentage of those working in art colonies, especially Cape Ann. Next slide, please. Alice Judson is a prime example of this. She was a student of John Henry Twachtman at the Cos Cob Art Colony in Greenwich, Connecticut in 1897 and 1898. There, Twachtman imparted the lessons of Impressionism to his students and encouraged them to paint outdoors. She made views subsequently of Gloucester, and Cape Ann became a major feature of her work. And she even wrote about its stunning landscape scenery, stating, quote, "Gloucester scenery has been made familiar to all lovers of art by the paintings that greet the eye in every exhibition throughout the land. For a variety of subjects, it is unrivaled in this country," end quote. Her glowing description, published in the American Magazine of Art in 1930, was the type of praise that would lure artists to Cape Ann and sustain its popularity. Now we're looking at Judson's Summer Day Gloucester Harbor, painted in the 1920s, on view at the museum. And this presents a view of the harbor from Banner Hill, the now famous prospect created by her predecessors and mentor, John Henry Twachtman. Now, whereas her predecessors offered a bird's eye panorama of an expansive sun-drenched harbor, Judson's close-up view from the bottom of the hill is more compressed, and there's greater pictorial emphasis on the cluster of buildings and moored boats, making the scenery, I think, more accessible and perhaps less mythic. Her treatment of Gloucester Harbor shares with her predecessors, though, a compositional flatness that derived from the high horizon line and the nearly square format of the canvas. So this is one I want to just add of several paintings by Alice Judson in the Clark collection. Next slide. Next up is Haley Lever. He's another artist who drew continual inspiration from Gloucester and found there an array of paintable motifs. He was born in Australia to English parents. He came to the United States in 1912, settles in New York City. By 1915, he makes his first visit to Gloucester on Cape Ann, and he continued to draw inspiration from its abundant waterfront views and busy harbor until the early 1930s. Harbor Scene Gloucester that you're seeing here on the slide was created in the 1920s when Lever's Cape Ann paintings achieved their height of popularity and critical acclaim. As in many of his waterfront views, he presents a row of these massive fishing schooners dominating a backdrop of dockside buildings and cottages. Lever's work is greatly indebted to post-impressionism, especially the work of Vincent van Gogh, an artist that he greatly admired. And this influence is powerfully conveyed in the emphatic use of black lines, the arbitrary use of vivid colors, active brushwork, which results in a rhythmic pattern and a rich surface vibrancy that is at once decorative, it's expressive, and yet it's still scenic, which is just what makes his work truly remarkable. Next slide, please. Okay, Carl Peters is another artist closely affiliated with Cape Ann. He's a generation younger than many of the artists in the exhibition, and he is more strongly affiliated with American scene and regionalist movements in American art. But his formative years were informed by the lessons of Impressionism and plein air painting. He first visited Cape Ann in 1915, and his favorite spot was not Gloucester. In fact, it was Pigeon Cove in Rockport. And from here, he could behold abundant views of the inlet as pictured in this canvas in the Clark collection. And it's not really until the 1920s that Rockport gained its own distinct reputation as an art colony on Cape Ann. And this was solidified with the establishment of the Rockport Art Association in 1921. And Rockport offered a variety of subject matter and fishing wharves and backstreet scenes. And Pigeon Cove in particular provided Peters with views of the large granite rocks that dominate the foreground of this composition and serve as a reminder of the once thriving granite industry in Rockport. Next slide. Now, to close our discussion of Cape Ann, we have to consider the contributions of Jane Peterson, the foremost woman painter of this period. Though these two paintings of Gloucester Harbor are not featured in the exhibition, they are part of the Tom Clark collection. Peterson visited Cape Ann between 1915 and 1919, when she started spending time exploring New England's art colonies after extensive time traveling and studying art in London, Venice, Paris, and Spain, where she studied with Sorolla, the internationally acclaimed Spanish Impressionist, who was known for his high-keyed colors, sun-drenched beach scenes, and flowing brushwork. Sorolla profoundly influenced Jane Peterson's art. And you're going to hear more about the influence of Sorolla on another artist in the exhibition from Alicia a little later. But it was from this expansive training and world travel that Peterson combines the lessons of Impressionism and Fauvism with her own approach that's characterized by spontaneity, strongly contoured forms, a brilliant palette, and bold design. On Cape Ann, she was enamored with the abundant harbor views and busy fishing life of the coastal community of Gloucester, and it would become one of her most celebrated subjects. It also greatly appealed to Jane Peterson's interest in plein air painting. She was very interested in capturing outdoor light and its effects, and that's why I'm showing you this image of her painting in Gloucester around 1915, and note the size of her canvas. This is not a small oil sketch by any means. I mean, she is painting exhibition size and scale paintings outdoors. Her dock scenes that you see in the two paintings on the right were also very popular with Jane Peterson and reflect her perceptive sense of design and dynamic brushwork. She would alternate between a fully loaded brush of paint to render ships and buildings, and then notice these willowy strokes of darker pigment to delineate the rippling effects of water. And that earned her many, many admirers in her day. And it was really in Gloucester where Peterson honed the elements of her innovative style, and that garnered her, again, critical acclaim in her day. Next slide, please. She applies this approach to other areas of the United States that she lived and visited. By the 1930s, Jane Peterson was dividing her time between New York City and Palm Beach, Florida. She reveled in resort life and the mingling of art and society. And the painting in my slide here is a depiction of the Cloister, a luxury hotel on Sea Island, Georgia, that opened in 1928 to great fanfare. And a place that Jane Peterson likely visited on her way to or from New York and Palm Beach. On the right, I'm showing you a hand-tinted postcard of the Cloister Hotel from the 1930s. Now we look at her painting. Rather than featuring the resort's lively social scene, Peterson focuses on the lush greenery of trees and shrubbery that envelops one of the arcing paths to the hotel's entrance. And in keeping with her working method, this scene was captured on the spot, and we've just discovered recently is the only known painting of Georgia that she executed. The painting is an important discovery and one we made shortly after the shipment of the works arrived at the Palmer in May. I was eager to see the painting as it was relatively new acquisition for Tom. Next slide, please. I knew the title was The Cloister, that was already established, but I was curious to see if there were any additional inscriptions. And indeed, this is actually images taken from my phone. Indeed, under the pencil inscription, The Cloister, I don't know if you can see it, Adam, maybe you can point it out. It's in graphite and it's in Jane Peterson's distinctive block lettering. Is another line of writing, but it's fainter and it's harder to read. But under directed light, me and Craig Witter, our preparator, were able to make out Sea Island, Georgia. And that just added a whole new layer of understanding to this work. And it's these types of discoveries that reveal new information about artists of this period, like Jane Peterson, and so many others that you're going to learn more about today, that make the Clark collection enriching and meaningful for a university art museum like the Palmer, dedicated to teaching and research. I'm going to turn the monitor over to Adam, who's going to share more discoveries and other geographic locales represented in the Clark collection.
Great, thanks. I'm going to begin by discussing another influential teacher, that is William Merritt Chase. He was the instructor of 5 of the artists in the exhibition, and a 6th artist studied also at one of his schools. Each of them had some level of training beyond Chase, either sort of before or after his education, his tutelage. But he's, one pathway for the kind of introduction and spread of Impressionism in the United States that we're sort of talking about in this exhibition in the early 20th century, as he had absorbed French Impressionist techniques. So he's a particularly well-known instructor of a lot of artists, actually, artists that aren't necessarily in the show, big names such as George Bellows, Edward Hopper, George O'Keeffe, and hundreds of others, literally. And there were 3 major forums for his teaching. He starts teaching at the Art Students League when he returns from his education abroad in Munich around 1878, 1879. He also then in the 1890s, and which is what you see here before you in these images, establishes the Shinnecock Hills, that's in the eastern end of Long Island, this summer art school, which is really the first school in America devoted to plein air outdoor painting. And he teaches there, consistently in the summer months for over a decade. And then the third kind of main venue for his instruction, what was initially called the Chase School in Manhattan, and he operates that for about a decade, beginning in the mid-1890s. It's later renamed, I think, the New York Art School, and then sort of absorbed and developed into what today is Parsons. But generally, he seems to have been, an exuberant and supportive teacher who introduced a kind of fresh approach to subject matter, and to the use of vibrant color and sort of vigorous brushstrokes that we see in the works in the exhibition. A couple things to point out about these images in particular. Chase's students came from a wide range of backgrounds, and I think Erin touched on this a bit, women were, consistently outnumbered by men in his summer classes. And you can kind of see that in just the groupings of the figures here. I also want to note just a kind of caveat around this term Impressionism, because Chase didn't necessarily think of himself or consider himself an Impressionist exactly, nor did his contemporaries describe him as such generally. And so there was a kind of indirect relationship to Impressionism, and Chase was far more kind of versatile and kind of wide-ranging, and his approach kind of owing as much, to his contemporary French artist as he did to, like 17th century Spanish artists like Velázquez and so on. So nonetheless, in Chase's work, there is, a clear kind of affinity for light and shadow, for broken brushwork, for modern subjects, and for painting out of doors. So the first student I want to just touch upon here as I go through these 5 and 6 is Mabel Woodward. She was, primarily a kind of Rhode Island artist. She was born and lived in Providence, Rhode Island. She was also active, particularly in Maine, in Algonquin, there, where there was actually another sort of smaller art colony. She taught for quite a while at the Rhode Island School of Design. It's while she probably encountered Chase first at the Art Students League, probably in the late 1890s when she studied there, and then I believe she spent at least one summer studying at Shinnecock on Long Island with Chase in the sort of outdoor setting, and some of that gets felt in her work in kind of, we could say, pretty direct ways, I think. These kinds of airy beach scenes that you see by her with direct precedence in the kinds of works that Chase was producing, beginning at least in the kind of early 1890s. So, sort of distilling this kind of Chase subject matter and this kind of focus on the play of kind of light and shadow. It's a kind of update of Chase in a more maybe informal guise, we might say, a little bit different from the genteel sort of leisure folks in Chase's example, which was probably executed, in or along kind of Shinnecock Bay area of Long Island, the Chase canvas, that is. Anne Cogden was another, and she had a slightly less direct influence from Chase. She studied in France and Boston, and then when back in the States, she studied under an artist, a British artist who was an assistant of William Merritt Chase by the name of Rhonda Holmes Nichols in Chase's summer school near Algonquin, Maine. And Nichols had kind of traveled very widely and eventually settled in the United States, where she painted, in various towns along the East Coast. And in a sense, she sort of served as a role model for young American women artists of the time, like Cogden. Cogden had further studies in the Boston area, in particular with Charles Woodbury, I believe, in sort of developing her kind of painterly style. Which, to my eye, is kind of characterized by this solidity of approaches. It's very kind of, blocks of color, this kind of arrangement of different sort of blocks of color, and these rich color contrasts that characterize her work. She also was particularly affiliated with Nantucket, the island off of Massachusetts, where she moved full-time in 1930 with her husband, and was really instrumental in the development of the various kind of arts organizations there, the Arts Association of Nantucket, for instance. George Innis is another artist who studied with Chase at one point. He originally hailed from St. Louis and had some education prior to kind of coming to the East. And he really established himself in Maine around 1915, in a kind of burgeoning art colony in Eastport, Maine. And, in addition to kind of painting and excelling as a painter, he was also a watercolorer, as president of the American Watercolor Society for a time, and, had a great affinity, a great connection to marine subjects, such as the one you see here, often favoring these kinds of bold primary colors, the sort of bright and sunny painting like this one resulted probably from travels that he made to the Caribbean, to Bermuda and the Bahamas in the early 1920s. He also himself then ended up being a teacher. He headed a summer school in Rhode Island in the early 1930s. Louise Brumbach hailed from Kansas City, and she studied with Chase in that Long Island school setting on Shinnecock, and was sort of a part-time New York resident, splitting her time with her country home and studio in Gloucester. And you see before you another kind of Gloucester subject. She helped found, the Gloucester Society of Artists and serve as its president. So she was very kind of integral to the kind of moving network of artists that were coming and going, and really sort of generating a community of exhibits and sort of teaching there as well. So, scenes like these, capturing the harbor and kind of different atmospheric conditions. This one on the left, Tom Clark's picture that's in the exhibition with these kind of great streaks of pink and violet, really sort of animating the sky there. And it's related to this other scene that we discovered in the Brooklyn Museum, probably a similar kind of vantage point along the harbor there, a slightly bigger painting, but with similar sort of framing, maybe some degree sort of down the road. Although a 1919 article does kind of talk about her, how she had a sort of fondness for sketching from her east window of the Gloucester cottage, particularly at sort of sunrise and sunset, these sort of magic moments of light. Just briefly back to our friend Irving Wiles, whom Erin talked about. He was one of Chase's earliest pupils at the Art Students League in New York, and they kind of maintained a lifelong relationship until Chase's death in 1916. They were pretty close, and even sort of traveled together a bit, even though he was about a decade younger than Chase. And he pretty closely kind of follows in the manner of Chase to some extent, in his sort of use of this kind of direct sort of fluid approach to the kind of application of paint. And I really sort of, admire the sort of economical way he's, described the water and the boat in the picture at left. And this painting was a part of this whole sort of group of these marine views that he was painting, usually in the North Fork, along the North Fork of Long Island, where he had established a summer home and studio beginning in the 1890s, and really sort of maintained it throughout the course of his life. So spending kind of some extended summers. Then I just show you, a kind of comparable, a related sort of scene from slightly earlier. He had a kind of predilection sometimes from these more sort of subdued, more darker kind of tonalities a little bit than some of the other artists in the show. But it's interesting, this kind of connection to Long Island that would have persisted with Chase during their lifetime, because Chase in his studio would have been on the sort of southern portion, and then Wiles on the north side, the North Fork there, not too far away. Turning to Maurice Braun, he began his professional studies at the National Academy in New York City in the late 1890s, and he sort of gestures towards, or sort of becomes a little bit of an established portrait painter, but it doesn't really satisfy him. He studies for 1 year with Chase, and then in 1909 or so, he leaves New York for California. And that's really where he kind of flourishes and develops as an artist, develops as a landscape painter. In particular, he founds the San Diego Academy of Art around those years in the early, sort of the second decade of the 20th century. And he's really a kind of champion of the Southern California landscape, in a sort of broad way. We could say, frequently kind of rendering these kind of subtle tones, often favoring these sort of pinks and blues, these kind of almost pastel coloring at times with the sort of soft edges. And really about, I think, communicating a sort of distinctive mood more than a kind of literal or accurate kind of transcription of nature is what Braun was sort of interested in. There's some ways in which his art was sort of inflected with or connected to his kind of spiritual beliefs. He was an adherent of theosophy, and there was a kind of local community, a local headquarters of the Theosophical Society, conveniently located in Point Loma, California, which is part of San Diego, I think. This is kind of infused with this sort of spiritual essence, partly, and he himself kind of cautioned against taking his landscapes too literally. Braun is the last of the kind of Chase students that were in the show, but we've made our way to California. So I'm going to stay in California for the remaining few artists and talk about them. So Anna Hills, another featured artist in the exhibition, initially studies in Chicago and New York and even Paris, and then makes her way to California, specifically to the kind of budding beach community of Laguna Beach, which is about, I think, 50 miles south of Los Angeles. She settles there in the early 1910s and is really a kind of instrumental leader in the Laguna Beach Art Association, these organizations that were springing up that help kind of promote and organize and exhibit the artists that were flocking to these towns. And then what would eventually become the Laguna Beach Art Museum. This painting by her probably depicts, we think, kind of red sandstone cliffs in the area, perhaps about 20 miles inland. There's a particular sort of well-known site known as Whiting Ranch Wilderness Park today that has these sort of really vivid and sort of unique red sandstone cliffs that would have been a feature she would have explored as other artists would have. And one of the distinctive things about her, and one of the things I like, is that she made sort of inventive use of the palette knife. You see some of that here, creating this kind of jagged, sometimes sort of blocky forms and sort of built up effect. It's almost kind of impasto effect, but also using the palette knife to sort of blend color, maybe sort of overlap and kind of pattern color in a way that's sort of distinctive from what you can do with a brush. Turning to Franz Bischoff, this painting in the show, and you see him there at the right. He immigrated to the United States in 1885, working kind of as a decorator of painter of ceramics, which was part of his training in Europe. And then he settles in Los Angeles, I think around 1906, and he becomes really involved with this growing community of painters in Laguna Beach. Again, like Anna Hills, summer classes were beginning to be taught by the 1920s. And he's painting kind of up and down the coast. This is a view of that particular kind of vicinity. And he was really fond of rendering these, these coastal vistas, in sort of vigorous brushstrokes, sort of in the mode of a kind of Winslow Homer late paintings on these kind of cliffside subjects that communicate some of the kind of awe and power and sort of drama of the tumultuous sea and so on. Anna, Stacy, another artist who originally hailed from Missouri. She studies in Kansas City and Chicago and is kind of living in Chicago. She's married to another artist by the name of John Stacy. And they're kind of dividing their time between Chicago and Gloucester, Massachusetts mainly. But there's kind of a good chance that this view here from 1915 was of a kind of bay and hillside in Northern California, where she went that year for the first time with her husband, partially, we think, to see the Panama Pacific International Exposition, that featured, hundreds of works of art, but among them, kind of touchstone works by French Impressionist artists, like Claude Monet, like Alfred Sisley, like Camille Pissarro and others. And this painting by Monet, that's now in the Rhode Island School of Design, was actually in the show in 1915 in San Francisco. Is something that he sort of may have encountered among, I think there were 7 works by Monet in that exhibition. Both artists kind of plant us in the midst of these meadows, these sort of flowering fields, and have, this kind of employing this use of these kind of short, quick kind of notational marks to some extent in Stacy's work as well. As a bit of an aside, just to come back to William Merritt Chase, and just to show, I guess, how wide-ranging geographically anyway his teaching was, he also held the summer class in California, in Carmel, California, south kind of the Bay Area, in 1914. And then he was also back in 1915, briefly, when he served on the art committee for the 1915 exhibition there in San Francisco. Turning to Selden Guile, very briefly, he too was likely influenced by the Panama Pacific International Exposition to some extent, settling in the Bay Area in the early part of the century. He had little formal training, and then this kind of outgrowth, partly maybe of the San Francisco exhibition of 1915, was this group of artists called the Society of Six that had sort of modernist proclivities at times, and you see some of that in this similar view of the railway in these hills in the Wright painting, the larger painting at Wright. This kind of way he's not necessarily abiding by any kind of strict kind of tenets of Impressionism proper, but there's a kind of a loosening of sensibility, a kind of vivid brushwork and simplified forms that almost, that those mountainscape kind of reading as a kind of flat abstract design in some sense. And then lastly, before I turn it back to Alicia, I just want to say a few words about Robert Wood, who was an English artist, British artist, who came to America in 1910, eventually finds his way to Texas, and is really kind of known for these paintings of blue bonnets. I understand, I think that technically blue bonnets bloom first anyway in the spring. And he was part of what was sometimes kind of derisively called the Blue Bonnet School that comprised other artists like Julian Onderdonk and others. And he eventually relocated in the 1940s to Laguna Beach himself and sort of became closely connected to the art colony there, where the likes of Anna Hills and Franz Bischoff and others had already kind of laid the groundwork for this vibrant artistic community in the previous decades. So I'm going to turn it back to Alicia, who's going to speak about the artist William Starkweather.
Thank you. So we have this painting by William Starkweather that's on view in the exhibition titled Le Rocher des Mouettes. And this is from 1909 that he painted it. And so this particular painting, I think, is noteworthy in our exhibition because it's of a non-American scene. So what we have here is of a French subject. And so William Starkweather had a particularly long career as an artist, and this is a rather large painting that's figuring into an early moment in his career as an artist. And so just a little bit of background on his artistic training. In 1899, he goes to study in Paris, and he's there until 1901. And this is a particularly significant moment for Starkweather because while he's here in Paris, he sees the work of Joaquin Sorolla, the Spanish painter that Erin mentioned earlier in our discussion. And so it's here in 1900 at the Paris World Exposition that he sees a work by Starkweather and is then determined to train with him. And so in 1903, he goes to Spain to seek out Sorolla and trains with him until 1906. So here on the right, I brought in this painting that Sorolla painted of Starkweather during their travels together in 1905, and it's in the collection of the Hispanic Society Museum and Library. And so particularly of note that Starkweather is drawing from Sorolla is that Sorolla was known as this plein air painter who is particularly well known for capturing lighting effects and his attention to color. Monet famously referred to him as the master of light. And so he also had this particular affinity for painting these beach scenes with youth, typically frolicking about. And so Starkweather is taking from his teacher this influence of here in this painting, we see him capturing the lighting effects on the rocks, as well as this interest in the youth. We see four young male beavers gathering here on top of the rocks, as well as the noticeable loose brushwork that he's adopting from Sorolla as well. Something that I found interesting during my research is that Starkweather is actually painting this painting in 1909, so not when he was in France, but recollecting on his travels there. And in 1909, he was actually an administrator and a translator for Sorolla, who had come to the United States for his retrospective exhibition at the Hispanic Society of America in 1909. And so there's this connection beyond the training between Sorolla and Starkweather that is happening at this time when the painting is being done by him. As well, I thought it was interesting that both artists shared this origin of both being orphans at a young age. And so this is more kind of speculative on my part, but I kind of wonder if that's something that they both bonded over additionally. Next slide. So I mentioned, next slide, please. Thank you. So I mentioned that this place that he's recording is a French subject. And so I found out that this is particularly of Belle-Île-en-Mer, which is in Morbihan, France. So that's after the southern shore of Brittany. And so this location is famous for its rock formations and grottos and villas. And in his later life, Starkweather actually said that he went to this location specifically because Monet had gone there often to paint. And so here on the right, I bring in a Monet painting of this location, this island, Belle-Île. And so we see that this location is important in the larger Impressionist project and to Impressionist artists, particularly Monet capturing the fleeting lighting effects and the changing atmospheric conditions. And so beyond just the influence from Sorolla, Starkweather is also figuring into this history as well and drawing on that, particularly by capturing these temporary effects through his brushwork. And so there's a lot more that can be said about Starkweather, but I'm going to end it there and we're going to move on to the Q&A.
Thanks, Alicia. While we open it up to the audience and everyone has time to kind of think of the questions and input those into the Q&A button, I'll just take a moment to pose one to you. I think in the course of your research on Starkweather, you came across a couple mentions of this painting in periodicals from the 1920s on the occasion of different exhibitions, I think. Would you say a bit more about those and that kind of response that he was getting to the works?
Yeah, so he exhibited the painting multiple times. As I said, it's a fairly large painting. And so while it was early in his career, I believe that this was a particularly important painting for him. And so when doing the research, it's not often that you come across critical mentions of the paintings that you're studying. And so the fact that we came across two was particularly interesting. And so there, in the 20s, when he was exhibiting at various galleries in New York, there are some reviewers that commented on the painting. In one instance in 1921 in the American Art News, a reviewer said, quote, "Gull Island is interesting for the countless fluttering forms that are seen at a distance against a background of blue sea with one large rock in the center of the picture, making so deep a shadow on the water that it accentuates the flying white forms and also the slender silhouettes of some beavers," end quote. And so, yeah, I think it's important that this was, brought on and talked about by the reviewers. And I think that there's definitely a lot more that can be said about this painting.
Hi, everyone. This is Brandy Breslin. I'm the museum educator, and I just wanted to kind of post in and say thank you to all of our speakers, to Erin, to Adam, and to Alicia. It was great to have you. I learned so much today from listening to you, so I'm grateful for that. Unfortunately, we're really out of time. We definitely had anticipated wanting to bring you into the conversation and answer your questions, but we do have a couple of our team members here who need to kind of flee, no, that's the wrong word, but anyway, who have other things to that they need to get to. So we're going to have to end. I have recorded the questions that came in through the Q&A, and I will get those answers for you from our presenters and make sure to email you. Since you did register, I have that information. So I apologize that we can't continue on with a more open Q&A session at the end, but I do again thank you all for joining us today, and I hope this has sparked your interest to come out to the Palmer and visit this beautiful collection. And the exhibition is just wonderful to see if you haven't seen it already, but even if you had, now that you have more in your mind to think about when you see it, come back again and see us. A reminder that we are still doing time ticketing. You can get your tickets online at the Palmer's website, or if you are just able to walk up, we usually can accommodate you as well that way, but do expect to need to get a ticket at the visitor desk. All right, thank you everyone, and have a good night.